In this video, I want to talk about some fairly common misconceptions about the law of Moses. Now, these misconceptions are often found amongst conservative Christians, and particularly Christian missionaries. And I bump into them all the time at Speaker's Corner, and you always say the same thing, actually, about the law of Moses. And we'll come to that now. And I want to read some words from a highly respected academic, Bart Ehrman, who's produced this marvelous book called The Bible, a Historical and Literary Introduction. And if you didn't know, Bart Ehrman is the distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the United States, of course. And this pretty amazing book, which I recommend, is published by Oxford University Press. And he addresses the overall conception of the law and some quite common misconceptions. Once I've read a couple of paragraphs from this book, I want to jump to the New Testament to see how the authors there view the Jewish law, the law of Moses, because there are some very different perspectives in the New Testament, actually, even within it, about the law of Moses. And this is often not realized by Christians, although biblical scholars have known about it for a very, very long time. So what is the law of Moses? Well, traditionally, they are, of course, the 613 commandments of the law given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. And you can read about all this in the book of Exodus. And these commandments are meant to be followed, obviously, by the Israelites. And Christians have quite a complex and difficult relationship with the Jewish law, which you'll read about in the New Testament in a second. But coming back to Bart Ehrman, he says on page 70, there are widespread misunderstandings of the nature and function of the law of Moses among modern readers, especially within some elements of the Christian tradition. Many conservative Christians think that the law of Moses is hopelessly detailed and impossible to keep, even though Jews have to keep it for salvation. It's a very common theme. I hear it all the time from evangelical Christians. In this view, it is the Christian gospel that can save people from the condemnation that comes from breaking the law, which by its very nature has to be broken, because no one can keep it. No one can keep the law, according to this view. Whether or not this view is right theologically, it is certainly not the view of the law that has been traditional within Judaism. And that was the first shock I had some time ago when, having believed, by the way, the evangelical gospel when I was a Christian, suddenly to realize that what I was believing about the law was not what Jews themselves believed about the law today or ever. This was a peculiarly Christian idea, not a Jewish idea about the law. And I thought, well, that's very peculiar. What's going on here? But Emma continues, the law has been traditionally seen as the greatest gift God has ever given his people. Here are instructions from the creator of the universe about how to worship him, how to relate to one another. Nothing could be better, says Bart Ehrman. The law of Moses may seem extraordinarily detailed to outsiders and in some places arbitrary and pointless, but every legal code seems extraordinarily detailed and arbitrary to outsiders. Just think of the laws that we have in America, says Bart Ehrman. Our laws are far, far more complicated than anything in the Hebrew Bible. Just the laws about how to drive cars are amazingly complex and would seem bizarre indeed to someone living in different contexts. Or think of all the laws about what one can or cannot personally consume in terms of, say, liquor, pills, and inhalants. Talk about detailed and seemingly arbitrary, he says. The law within ancient Israelite religion and then later within Judaism was never meant to be the way of salvation. This is the first big point he makes. And if you read the Torah, you'll find this is the case. The law within ancient Israelite religion was never meant to be the way of salvation. It was never thought that a Jew had to earn God's favor by doing the law, and that when he or she fails, as always happened, it meant being condemned to eternity in hell. This is not the teaching of the Torah, he says, and he's right, I think. This view very much puts the cart before the horse. In traditional Jewish thinking, salvation has already come to Jews by virtue of their election as the people of God. This is a really important point this Bart is making. Keeping the law was the reverential response to the salvation that God had already provided. People did what God wanted precisely out of gratitude for the favor already showered on them, in loving response to his kind and glorious act of salvation. This overall conception of the law is presented in the law itself. In fact, at the very beginning of the legal section of the book of Exodus, in highly significant and meaningful words. And then Bart quotes from Exodus chapter 19, which goes like this: "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you shall obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." That's Exodus 19, verses 3 to 6. And Bart Ehrman comments, notice the sequence here. First, God saved Israel from their slavery in Egypt and brought them to himself on eagle's wings. In response, they are to obey his voice and keep the covenant, which he had already made with them. When they do so, they will become a special people before God, a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Failing to do what God demanded, of course, had very serious consequences. But there is nothing in the law that was outrageously difficult to do, any more than is the case with American laws. It really is not that difficult to refrain from idolatry, murder, and sorcery, or to slaughter your ox if it gores your neighbor to death. End quote. It's not that difficult to obey the law, Bart Ehrman seems to be saying. How different, of course, from the common Christian message. It's impossible to break the law, which is why we need the gospel, the Christian gospel. So I think that's very, very interesting. And I just want to supplement what Bart Ehrman is saying with some quotes from the Bible in other places. And just to reinforce the point that Bart is making about the law not being too difficult to obey, this is, of course, contrary to what Christians usually say. God himself, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 11 onwards, says the following: "Surely this commandment that I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it too far away." This commandment is the commandment to obey the law, by the way, which you can read at the beginning of chapter 30. This commandment to obey the law is not in heaven, that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it? No. The word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 onwards. Isn't that extraordinary? So the law is very close to you. It's not far, far away. It's not in heaven. It's not over the sea. It's close to you. It's close to you. And you're meant to clearly obey it. That's the point. God's exhorting, encouraging the Israelites to obey the law and choose life. And as it goes on in verse 15 onwards about choosing life by obeying the law. So God expects people to obey the law clearly in the Torah. So just moving on briefly to what we read in the New Testament. And I want to look at some words of Jesus, attributed to Jesus at least, and then look at what Paul had to say about this issue of the relationship between God and the law and his people, and whether or not we should obey it. According to Matthew's gospel, this is the first gospel in the New Testament, chapter 5, we read the following words. These are very famous words. And I remember when I was a Christian, actually, I remember a friend of mine, also a Christian, he was studying at King's College here in London, doing a theology degree. And he was telling me about what he had been taught in class by some very eminent New Testament scholars. So these are all Christians themselves, actually. I won't mention their names. And he mentioned this passage and a couple of other passages as kind of really problematic in a way for Christians. And I remember hearing about them and the way he spoke about them. And I felt quite threatened, actually, if I'm to be honest, about the meaning of these passages, because it's not what I believed as a Christian. And I was supposed to be a follower of Jesus, and I was finding the teaching of Jesus problematic, as I'm sure most Christians actually do, if they were very, if they confided how they really felt. Because according to Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said the following: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments, the commandments of the law, whoever breaks the least of them and teaches others to do the same would be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Who teaches the law, it teaches how to obey it, we call great in the kingdom of heaven. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." End quote. Matthew 5:17 to verse 20. So you see how central obedience to the law is for Jesus in this passage. Very important. And if you don't even obey the least of it, or you teach those not to obey the least of it, you'll be called the very, very least in the kingdom of heaven. So, for example, the food laws, if you were to teach as a supposed disciple of Jesus that pork could be eaten, for example, prohibited in the law, of course, then clearly that's not something that Jesus would have approved of. You'd be called the very, very least person for having done that. But if you teach the law and uphold the law, you will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So that's very interesting, I thought. So that was the first ouch moment. And another one, actually, which is very much less known, but equally relevant, is towards the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus denounces the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, why is he denouncing? He's always denouncing them in Matthew. What's their terrible crime? What's their sin? Well, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples," in other words, everyone, "the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat." In other words, they teach in Moses' authority, like you would in the synagogue. They sit on the seat. "Therefore," says Jesus, "do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach." In other words, they're hypocrites, basically. That's why he denounces them in the first place. But in fact, you should obey what they teach, because they teach the law. So in other words, Jesus is a Torah-observant Jewish rabbi in Palestine, and he's teaching obedience to the law. This is really a really important point. And of course, Christians today don't follow this teaching, that they would normally eat pork and they would abandon the law. Virtually, not all of it, but nearly all of it. There might be one or two commandments in the 10 commandments they might obey, of course, but mostly they don't follow them at all. Now, where does this idea come from? Why don't they obey the law anymore? We have Jesus' clear teaching in Matthew, so why are they not obeying the law? Well, this is the question. It's actually a big issue in the early church. People like James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul were at loggerheads over this issue. But Paul, according to the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, taught something which is very striking if you're not aware of it. This is what Paul teaches in Ephesians 2, verse 15. He, Jesus, has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, so that he might create in himself one new humanity in the place of two. So Paul says that Jesus has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances. Now, I've just quoted from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, do not think I have come to abolish the law. And indeed, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the person who teaches and practices and upholds the law of Moses, the 613 commandments given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, of course. Paul says, no, he's abolished them. So there's a fundamental contradiction here. It's very, very striking. Now, there are many other passages I could read from the Bible which are related to this, but I don't want to go on and on about this. But I just wanted to share with you some common misconceptions, particularly from missionary Christians, about the Jewish law. It's not meant to be the way of salvation. It's not meant to be something we can't obey. It's not something that's been abolished, which they will argue as well. I know Paul says that, but Jesus, of course, is more important in the scheme of things. Why? Because he was a great prophet. He was the Messiah sent by God. And if he says something about the law, we go with that, not what someone else said who actually never met Jesus. If you think about it, he never actually met. He converted to what we call Christianity a number of years after Jesus left the scene. He never met him. So there we are. I just wanted to share those passages with you. I recommend this book, The Bible, by Bart D. Ehrman, a historical and literary introduction. Unfortunately, it's not cheap, but if you really want to, fork out some money, I do recommend it. Until next time.